Welcome, everybody. You're all very welcome yet again to this summer school talk, this summer school lecture. Um, I'm delighted to introduce this afternoon the newly minted Dr. Richard Kendall. He graduated when? Last week?
Wednesday.
Wednesday, not even a week ago. So welcome, Richard. It's lovely to have you here. Richard studied at the University of Edinburgh, and he recently completed his PhD entitled Strategies of Cooperation, Cultural Memory in the Early Centuries in Olbia in the Early Centuries AD. Prior to his PhD, Richard took a bachelor's degree at UCL, an MPhil in classical archaeology at Magdalen College, Oxford, and an MRes in ancient history at the University of Birmingham. And today he's going to talk to us about Olbia, the happy city on the northern Black Sea coast. So I'm going to hand everything over to you, Richard.
Yep, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the congratulations, Ricardo. I will just share my screen. And how is that? Can everyone see it? Yep, perfect. Okay, so Olbia, the happy city on the northern Black Sea coast. I think we can all kind of work out the pun straight off the bat. So Olbia, Olbiot, happy, prosperous, blissful. This is quite a common name for colonies, but the one I'm going to be talking about is in modern day Ukraine, not a million miles away from Odessa, about 100 kilometers northeast. And I sort of focused on a very specific part of the history of this time, but I'm going to try and present a pretty broad history of the Black Sea and then focus in on a couple of case studies. So uh, there we go. So this is the basic structure of today's talk. There's probably a lot of words on here that you might not have seen before, might not even know how to sort of pronounce. It was a bit of a challenge for me as well. Number one, of course, is Olbia, which is Olbia in modern day Ukrainian. And but all will be revealed. As I say, I'm going to start with some of the history and the research that has been undertaken on the city itself and on the Black Sea more widely. Then we're going to be talking about lions and tamgas. I think, given that I'm introducing probably a part of the ancient world that we're not sort of not part of the kind of common um, roster of places, I might actually ditch the third example, case study Faldois and Ismios. So do not adjust your sets when we jump from case study one to case study three, which is this one on architecture for Eusebius and Areti. And then I'm going to kind of bring this to a conclusion. Just to start us off, it would be remiss not to mention a slightly more unhappy, tragic situation, of course, which is affecting Olbia and the whole of Ukraine at the moment, which is, of course, the Russian invasion, the escalation of which through 2022 expanded to include a lot of the areas near Mykolaiv, which is where Olbia is. And indeed, the site has been bombed. So obviously that area is still very much the front line. The degree to which the site has been damaged, the degree to which museums have been looted is obviously still up in the air and changing every day. But I thought I would put a few sites on here if you're interested in helping the cause. And as I say, I was based in Scotland for a long time. I'm sort of some of these Scottish sites are things which I have active experience of, so I can vouch for them personally. To begin the talk, what you're looking at here is the first map of Europe. Not perhaps immediately clear that that's what we're looking at. This is the map from Dura-Europos, and probably a little bit easier if I do this, which is mapping all of those little sites onto a Google Earth document. And as you can see, it's got Olbia on it. Olbia written with Barystones. That's a whole thing, which I'm not even going to go into, but that's a very complex issue of whether or not Barystones or Olbia is used. Barystones was the word used for was the name of the Dnipro in antiquity. The Dnipro being the largest river running straight through up to Smolensk and what have you, through Kiev, down into the Black Sea. And near where the Dnipro meets the southern Bur, The other river, that is where Olbia was situated. So just to give you a little bit of temporary context, and all of these sites, modern day Romania, near Tiras is near is on the Dniester, so into Moldova as well, excuse me, and onto Crimea and the Kerch. We zoom into Olbia itself, we'll see some of the sort of local geography that affects the place. Olbia is a little bit set back from the coast of the Black Sea itself. It's kind of hidden behind this liman. Berezan, which you can see on the left of the screen, is the earliest colony of the Greeks in the northern Black Sea area. That was going from about the mid-7th century BC, and it continued. It eventually basically became a bit of a satellite of Olbia, because Olbia is kind of easier to defend. And also Berezan started as a peninsula and then eventually became an island. It's an island today. Down at the bottom, Achilles racecourse. This was sort of the southern extent of Olbia's kind of horror, which there were several sites. But yeah. So you can see the extent of archaeological excavation. You can see the proclivity of Olbian settlements around, Olbiapolitan settlements around. And, this is testament to the fact that Olbia is actually one of the studied sites in this part of the world for antiquity. It's the only Greek colony on the northern coast of the Black Sea that was not subsequently used as a medieval city. Actually, it's a remarkable level of preservation of the classic places like Chersonesus on Crimea, as we saw. I mean, that later became an extremely important site in the medieval period, indeed, where Vladimir the Great ended up getting converted to Christianity, to an extremely important site in the history of the Kievan Rus. Also, I believe, where the Mongolians invented biological warfare. So, as I say, Olbia had really none of that after the 5th century AD. It really wasn't occupied again until archaeologists discovered it in about the late sort of 18th century, started digging it in the mid-19th century, and really haven't stopped. There's been a whole lot of excavation on this, which is very helpful to me, because with that degree of history of archaeological excavation, it means that a lot of the artifacts from the city are now divvied up around various museums in Europe, in the States. Even though it was obviously impossible, I started my PhD at the end of 19. I very briefly went to Ukraine and sort of looked at some of the museums there, but that was very much a preliminary get my bearings of the history of the site. And then, of course, because of the pandemic, because then, of course, of the tragic military situation, it proved impossible to ever go back. But there's a lot of material in British Museum. I spent some time in Warsaw looking at archives there. So because of that long history of excavation, Olbia is actually quite spread out. So you might be surprised, even though this isn't somewhere that you've probably heard of, you might have actually seen some of these artifacts around. There's quite a famous one in the Louvre, which we might, you can ask me about in Q&A perhaps. Yeah. Let's do a little bit of a cheat sheet just to get your head around the place. So founded in the late 736th century BC, there's about 1,000 different foundation dates for the site. Subsequent, of course, as I say, to Berezan, probably formed just by colonists from Miletus, but probably also from Berezan itself. Getting to know the area a bit more, we're maybe thinking more seasonal occupation, eventually a permanent settlement there, but a better harbor, a better sort of easier, more defensible area, more on the mainland of the Ukraine, later found. It's sort of stereotypically the most northerly Greek polis. It's literally the second most northerly Greek polis from the ancient world. And as I say, it's at the confluence of the Bur and Dnipro. Patron deities, Ietros, Delphinius, Achilles. I'm not going to dwell too much on religion. It formed a chapter of my thesis. So if that's your thing, you can ask me a question about this, but just, so you know the sort of main guys we're dealing with. And a couple of important events, Siege of Zopyrion and Getic definitely going to be important. So get those in your head. I'll talk about them a little bit more. Then this just sort of overlaid on the top of the topographic map is all of the different trenches and excavations plotted. So there's over, I think there's 20 trenches, testament, as I say, to those literally centuries of work now on Olbia, from various different institutions, up to, I should say, well, pretty much until 2021, actually, with the last being a joint Ukrainian Polish excavation. As I say, I particularly focused on the early centuries AD, so I'm going to be talking in my case studies about that time. This isn't something that you need to know in great detail, but I thought I would just give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening with this area. So first of all, what's this thing that I keep referring to, the Getic sack? Well, the Getae, you may have heard them under their other name, is the Dacians, who are a little bit more familiar perhaps to us. The ones Trajan beats about in the sort of early 2nd century AD. So think modern Romania, think that sort of area. Indeed, if you read certain Romanian scholars, actually descended, the ancestors of modern Romanians. But the Getae in the mid-1st century, essentially they're ruled by this leader called Burebista. He unifies these tribes in this region, and he starts attacking the Greek colony. So a lot of those sites I mentioned earlier, places like Istria, Odessos, things that are in modern-day Romania, other sites that were on that map we looked at earlier, were also destroyed by the Getae. And then Olbia was about as far east as they made it. Destroyed in the mid-1st century BC, this part of the world. And, you know, in the scholarship, this is the sort of sliding doors moment, the dividing line between what we would say is Greek Olbia and Roman Olbia, which is what happens subsequently. You can also hear pre-Getic and post-Getic. My research is actually undermining. What I look at, what I studied, is to say, well, actually, this division is arbitrary, because a lot of what's happening in the post-Getic period is actually a continuation of what was happening in the pre-Getic period. And what's more, as I will explain later, very specific examples of actually people living in those early centuries AD after the Getic fact, specifically utilizing aspects of the pre-Getic history in order to make accommodation, in order to create a community, create cohesion in what is now a very different demographic, Yeah. So as you might be kind of recognizing, Greco-barbarian, and I use that term in inverted commas, events are often seen as these sort of drivers of change in not only Olbia, but in a lot of Black Sea studies normally. We are talking about scenes like the Siege of Zopyron. Now, actually, the Siege of Zopyron is not so much Greco-barbarian. In fact, it's one of Alexander the Great's generals starts to, well, get a bit big for his boots and sort of goes to attack Olbia. But what happened, the Olbian state decides to enfranchise all of its foreign residents, by which we almost certainly assume Scythians and various other non-Greek peoples. And it is this action which Macrobius, in quite a late tells us, was able to actually win the day and defeat the after which there's a sort of economic boom. So, and then, of course, I've already mentioned and explained the Getic sack, but this sort of Greco-barbarian conflict, cohesion narrative is really kind of endemic to the study of the Northern Black Sea. And this goes right back to our foundational text of academia. Scythians and Greeks there at the top left is from 1913 Mins. It's probably still the most influential English language text on the Northern Black Sea coast. It's an absolute, I mean, it's really very good, particularly for the time. Iranians and Greeks in South Russia by Rostovtsev, equally, I would say, influential 1922 work. Again, you're seeing this kind of like where you have the Scythians over here and the Greeks over here, and kind of never the twain shall meet unless it's some kind of conflict or something where they might be communicating, they might be trading, still looking at very much a kind of us and them scenario. And this even this goes back, this continues into the present day. Scythians and Greeks about 20 years old now. Obviously, it's it is a tribute to Minz's work. but sort of falls into the same category. And the Scythian Empire is an absolutely mad work, I would say, which posits several things which are very intellectually interesting, but perhaps not something I would agree with. Again, seeing the Scythians very much as a sort of completely distinct, separate people who are almost inherently averse to any sort of influence, um, creation of something a little dramatic in. We have a few reasons for that kind of way of looking at the world in that sort of dichotomy of, Greeks over here, Scythians over here. I'm not expecting you to read the whole thing here, but you may know of the story of Skylides, who was a Scythian king who was at Olbia, according to Herodotus. He was the son of a Greek mother, again, a little bit more complex than that picture already. So he had this great love of Greek culture. He used to go to Olbia. He would take off all of his Scythian clothes. He would put on Greek clothes. And then eventually he did the worst thing you could possibly do, which was take part in Dionysiac rituals. One of the Olbians sort of went over to the Scythian contingent who were outside the city walls and was like, hey, you might want to take a look at this. They see him. They're absolutely ashamed. They're disgusted by what they see. So they chase him. They chase him all the way to the Danube. And there, for his sins, they chop his head off. So you have a couple of these stories. You have the Skylies one. There's one with Anacharsis, who also tries to take part in Greek religious rituals and is also killed by his brother, I think, shot. And so this and them narrative does have precedent. I would argue it's a bit overplayed. There's also this question, particularly with Herodotus, whether he'd actually ever been to the Black Sea. A lot of people argue that he went to Olbia and that's where he heard these stories. Me and a couple of other scholars actually disagree with the reasons, again, if you're interested. There is another really interesting text about Olbia that I'd like to talk about just a little bit before I go into my case studies. It's this oration by Dio Chrysostom, who, unlike Herodotus, actually went to Olbia. He was there. He was exiled by Domitian. He was actually interested in going to the Getae to see what they were all about. And he went to Olbia on the way, and he had this very interesting response to them. So he delivers this oration back in his hometown of Prusa in modern-day Turkey, where he basically says, well, all of the ancient Greeks who I found, and they were definitely Greeks, they were fighting the Scythian nations, they were all so Greek, it's untrue. Like, they're more Greek than us, but like in a really old-fashioned, very antiquated way of being Greek. So, for example, he talks about this practice of sexuality, which he says is a heritage among them from their city of origin, Miletus. They all know the Iliad by heart. In fact, they're pretty Homer obsessed. They don't really acknowledge any other poet apart from Homer, to the point where Dio actually mentions another quite famous poet, and they're completely lost to who he is. And as you can see, they all actually look like Homeric heroes as well. They were all like the ancient Greeks described by Homer, long-haired with flowing beards, and the only one of them who actually was clean-shaven was mocked because apparently he was trying to up to the Romans by shaving his beard. He wasn't acting like a true good Homeric Greek as any good Olbia would. This is another quote from Dio Chrysostom. I think interested over this, but it's interesting here because it actually says, Dio, despite painting this quite broad picture, a broad brush picture of, Greeks who are Greeker than the Greeks against, the barbarians at the gates, and he talks about, actual conflict. He's like, right, they needed to shut the gates because there was about to be an attack. He also says, well, look, after Brittany has been taken on the occasion, mentioned sack, that is our only testimonial of I should say. People once more formed a community with the consent. So again, we have this sort of like slightly pointing towards something a little bit more cohesive, rather than this sort of authoritative Greeks versus, us versus them. So with that sort of background out the way, I'm just going to briefly consider two of the chapter thesis. And as I say, if we have a little bit of time, maybe get to another one. But just to begin, lions and tamgas. What you're looking at here is an image from the Hermitage Museum. You can get it on the website, and you see these two lions. Now, these two marble lions were almost certainly made in Turkey, probably in Miletus itself, and imported into Olbia in the Archaic period, in the late 6th century BC. They may have been funerary monuments. They may have been, guarding gates, as we see, they're being kind of used for today. They are from very early in the history of Olbia. There was a lot of kind of architecture and sculptural importation and that sort of data from the metropolis, from Miletus to Olbia, going on. That's all well and good, but what's particularly interesting is what happens to them in the early centuries AD. This is quite a clear image, but I hope you can see it. I've got a few other images which are drawings, so they might even come out. You might be able to see that there are these sort of scratches on side. They look a little bit like doodles, or if you're kind of absent-mindedly drawing certain lines. So if you can't see here, perhaps it's obviously a lot clearer here on these drawings. As you can see, there's absolutely hundreds. There's loads of them. There are hundreds. This is a little bit of a truncated volume of, but these are tamgas. These are a nomadic sign system which derives from animal branding, from actually physically putting these markers onto animals, and then is found in all sorts of different contexts, on coinage, on military apparel, on images from on all sorts of artifacts, magical use, on architectural features, in houses, in caves, and on these lions. And as you can see, they're found in great abundance, these lions. This is a scan here, so we can see all sorts of these overlapping, looking at each other. Tamgas are from the Sarmatians. So the broad history of Eurasian people groups in this area in modern day Ukraine is essentially a story of a transition in the sort of classical period from those Scythians to Sarmatian, kind of wander west in the last century BC, and very much established there by the early centuries AD. They bring with them tamgas. So this is very clearly something which is a product of that early century AD period. So we've got these lion sculptures that were made out over half a century before the tamgas are being used on them. And when the tamgas are being used, they're being used in great abundance. Now, as I say, tamgas are found in all sorts of things. As I say, they come from animal breeding. We can see that in art. These are some images from the Kingdom, which is another whole thing in the northeast Black Sea. It's very, very fascinating. I don't have time to go into. Coined, fortified, all sorts of things with tamgas. I'm quite fond of this one on the right here, because as you can see, they've actually drawn a cow and then used a tamga to make the nose and the mouth of the cow. So we've got kind of artistic uses. We've got sort of, in the bottom left, you might be able to see they're even seemingly to kind of use tamgas to imitate specific letters from ancient Greek, from the Greek alphabet, and on magical sources up in as well. Phosphor, I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. I can't go into, but really fascinating. And we have a few of these. There are just this absolute abundance in Greek contexts, in Greek cities, on Greek monuments. One of them is this image that we're looking at, this slab from Pantocrapaeum, modern day Kerch, which is, again, as you can see, absolutely inundated with tamgas. And the other ones are these lion, another encyclopedia of Tam. Now, the fact that there are so many, and we can actually pinpoint them, as I've done in this slide, we can find them from other archaeological, like, pots, coins, all sorts of different, tinker, plummet, ceramics, all sorts of amphorae and what have you. We can find these tamgas in different archaeological contexts. We're looking at an accumulation over actually several centuries. These tamgas weren't all made at once. They weren't all produced. This isn't one singular act of just vandalism. This isn't graffiti. This is actually an emerging process whereby, tamgas are accumulating on this artifact over time. So we're looking at sustained engagement with these lion sculptures, canvas for something new, as a canvas for, summation artwork being utilized on an object which is, not only Greek, is actually, at this point, ancestrally Greek. This has been standing in this several centuries at this point, is now being utilized as a space for this assertion of summation culture. But actually, in this kind of light, is what we're looking at an assertion of summation culture? Is this an act of complete control and dominance, in the way that maybe one might sweep over the face of a king in order to, prove that you have defeated them? Is the fact that these are accumulating over time? Clearly, the Olbia-Politans who were living in the city didn't hide these once they started to accumulate. They didn't sort of, move these lions to a separate space where they couldn't be, attacked in this way. Actually indicates something which is a little bit more consensual, a little bit more like this is a we are encouraging, creating a sort of visual avenue for the sort of cohesion and community that we see in other aspects. And as I say, I would I have a second case study which I'm skipping over. That question of community forming and this sort of third space between Greek and non-Greek in this period, Summation, and earlier period, Scythian, is a really interesting space. And those lions are a really interesting visual example of something which kind of undermines that notion of us, them. Something where actually it looks as though communities of differing ethnicities are at least acquiescing in the creation, not actively. Case study 3, as I say, we've jumped over the other one. The crypt of Eurysbius and Arete. Again, not expecting this to be something that leaps out as an immediately known site. But I'm using this because I spent a chapter in my thesis talking actually about names. Naming culture at Olbia is really, really interesting. We have a lot of really unique names surviving from epigraphic documents which list boards of administrative bodies, archontes, strategoi, and agoranomoi, which list a lot of names we don't find anywhere else. Why? Well, because these are names of Summation provenance. These are names with a linguistic identity from Iran. So again, we're seeing this combination of Greeks and Summatians, non-Greeks, participating in civil bodies, which are archons, archontes, agoranomoi. These are Greek civic bodies. You find them all across the Greek world, all across now. We're talking about the Roman Empire in the Roman East. But we're finding Summatians holding these posts. They're utilizing their Summation name, not taking, we might say, oh, well, there were, probably Scythians in, that siege of Zopyrene I mentioned earlier. There were enfranchised Scythian foreigners who helped save the city. We don't see Iranian Scythian names in documents from that period. We do in the early centuries AD. They're not in conflict with the Greek names. They're actually part of board. In fact, you'll often get, Akragos or Akros, a sort of Iranian name, son of, Socrates, or vice versa. You'll have people with Greek names giving their children summation names, summations, Greek names, summation, Greek, all sorts of things, all in the same civic body, all in elite positions in Olbiapolitan society. And so this is a real feature of that early centuries AD. But that doesn't mean that we're actually talking about anything completely different. We do also at the same time see some really interesting continuities across Olbiapolitan history. I like to talk. Eusebius is a really cool example. So as I say, this is onomastic research. This is stuff about names. The lexicon of Greek personal names is an absolute wonder resource. And there's all sorts of pros and cons to this, which I won't go into for lack of time. But albeit even though looking at names does have its problems, which is so kind of unique and interesting, of what it really does bear consideration. So, this is a lot of what I've been saying, over 1,000 names surviving, nearly 700 individual names. Obviously, names are repeated again and again, with this large proportion of names. Eusebius is a name which is only found 28 times in the entire ancient Greek world. In the whole from the Archaic period to late antiquity. 28 individual instances of this name, 26 of which come. So a very unique name. Something interesting is going on here. There are lots of theories as to who the sort of Eusebius was, who this sort of figure, this famous local hero, or possibly someone who instituted some large demographic change or some political revolution of something. There's lots of theories about who this person might be. I'm not going to give you an answer because I don't think that's possible for one. But also, it's speculative regardless. But from the late 5th century BC right through to the 3rd century AD, we are finding people called Eusebius in the onomastic record. Yeah, this very unique name, totally sort of out there popularity. The first instance of this, one of the first instances of this name coming from an actual religious community founded to honor Eusebius. So again, the whole questions about what they're honoring him for, and this body here, who seem to be a family, are participating in this cult of Eusebius, dedicating a statue to Sota in honor and also of Eusebius, their cult of him. And then much later, 2nd century AD, several centuries, and each one of those containing Eusebioi. In the 2nd century AD, we have a huge crypt, one of the largest crypts in Olbia, in a very prominent location, just where the old North Gate used to be, by the altar of the city. This crypt, which, as per a marble altar which was found within, was dedicated to Eusebius and his wife Arete. So, despite having this great demographic change, despite having this influx of summation names within the Olbiapolitan onomastic record, we're also seeing these kind of uniquely local developments, which are way back in the classical period, continuing on and continuing in positions of great prominence. Marble altars, large crypts, large architectural projects, and again, Eusebioi being sons and fathers with summation names. So we're really seeing something which is not about actually much more about a community, something in between the two, which is being created, which is being fostered, which is both bringing some new elements, but also respectful and adapt what's happening in this. So if I just kind of bring this to a conclusion, the readaptation of the archaic lion sculptures, we haven't talked about numismatics, as I say, for reason of time, but certainly those sort of naming traditions, they show this knowledge and also an engagement with the relics of the city's history. These iterations of cultural memory undermine that scholarly convention I've been referring to, a lot of, not only dividing the city into and post-Getty periods, but also illustrating those sort of monolithic ethnic conceptions. Greek over here, Sarmatians over here, Scythians over here. But I think that this is being done very pointedly. This is an administrative choice to utilize some of the aspects of the city's history to make a cohesive community in the early centuries. And I think that's what science, I think that's what's happened with the administrative bodies, where we get mixed groups of names. And as I say, if I had time, we would also as well. Here's my bibliography. Thank you very much.